Okay, welcome back everyone to the VOX-Pol guest lecture series. My guest today is Dr. Joe Whittaker, who is a lecturer in cyber threats at the University of Swansea. His primary research interest is online radicalization, and he's a member of VOX-Pol. He is here today to talk about ethics, in particular, the catch-22 represented by researcher welfare and institutional ethics within online terrorism and extremism research. So without further ado, I'm just going to hand over to Joe.
Thanks very much, Sean. But thanks very much for the introduction. As you mentioned, I'm very interested in ethics. I actually come to this lecture and this research from kind of dual roles insofar as I'm a researcher in this space. I spend a lot of my time looking at difficult content and problematic content. But at the same time, I'm actually about to step down, but presently the co-chair of my department's ethics committee. So while on one side, I see kind of myself frustrated in a lot of instances, and I'll talk about a lot of the experiences with the people we've been talking to, by overly strong, ethics committees that feel like they're blocking research. On the other side of it, I do see kind of the vast range of ethics applications that a criminology department gets, and that a lot of them need to think a lot more carefully about a range of ethical issues. But in particular today, the research that I'm going to be talking about relates to researcher welfare. So it's part of larger research, which I'll get to in a couple of slides' time. But I'm Dr. Joe Whittaker. I'm a lecturer at Swansea University, and I'm presenting this research on behalf of Elizabeth Pearson, Tilbach and Sarah Ziga, Farangis Atimodorovo, and Maura Conway. So it's kind of a lot of cooks together working on this piece of research, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail as we move to it. So it's probably worth a very, very short primer to start off with. So hopefully most people watching this will know that there are more and more conversations about ethics in our space of kind of researching extremism and terrorism, specifically thinking about the online domain. It's certainly a growing conversation. So when I started my PhD in 2016, there really wasn't too much of a discussion about this sort of thing. I had to think when I submitted my own ethics proposals, I had to think quite a lot about, kind of from an internal university perspective, ethics was seen as something that was handled by the institution, by the ethics committees there, but it was, unlikely to be a big point of discussion at, for example, a conference or a series of research papers. However, in recent years, I think that has that started to change. We've started to see more of a discussion about ethics. Most of that discussion so far has really been about, what we would think of as the more traditional ethics issues. So, consent, anonymity, as well as just the more kind of general protection of participants. And we'll talk a little bit about that distinction between participant and researcher welfare in a bit. However, I would say, and this isn't an exact date, but I would say it was probably about 5 years ago that discussions of researcher welfare really started to pop up. And I think one of the big catalysts for this was the rise and subsequent fall of the so-called Islamic State. Basically, a lot of researchers had spent a really, really long time looking at very disturbing, very graphic, very violent content. And after a while, they were kind of beginning to speak about it. A lot of this started off as conversations on Twitter or maybe Q&As at conferences and things like that. And then all of a sudden, people really started to talk about it in more formal ways. It's also worth noting, and this certainly isn't the lecture to do it, but obviously this period of time coincides with the kind of resurgence of the far right online as well. And many of the tactics that I'm going to talk about, like doxing and trolling and things like this, is something that the far right have been doing a lot as well. So on both of the kind of main two things that researchers in our domain are looking at primarily, there are a lot of individuals with a lot of bad experiences. So yeah, I think since then there has been a little bit more work on this topic. So about 5 years ago, there were a few workshops thinking about this. So we hosted one in Swansea, as well as there was one as a workshop at the VOX-Pol conference in Amsterdam in 2018. And then I think thinking about research, this has really been more in the last year or two. There's been about half a dozen pieces of research that have looked specifically at online researcher welfare within the online domain. I've included as one of the last slides kind of a further reading type thing. So if you are interested in kind of delving a little bit deeper on this topic, I think that's either the last slide or the penultimate slide. You can look at your own pace. Okay, so let's think a little bit about the project that I've been a team member on. So this grew out of a successful research bid at the sandpit of the 2019 Terrorism and Social Media Conference. And I'll use this opportunity to plug the conference, which will run again next summer in 2024. So please get your papers in for that. But it was a group of individuals that bid for a project to speak specifically to researchers in this space to try and detail their experiences working in the online domain at Extremism and Terrorism. Eventually, it ended up as a team of researchers from 5 institutions. So that was Swansea, Dublin City University, Royal Holloway, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and Hedaya. So we published this main report, which I've got a graphic for, earlier on this year. There is also a launch video in which we talk about some of the findings from that report. So I'm not really going to go into too much detail, or at least I'm going to be talking about something quite specific today. But if you want to just in general read about the experiences of our researchers that we spoke to, then feel free. The report is available open access on the VOX-Pol website, as well as there was an hour-long launch for it. But the report sought to do 3 things. First of all, think about the harms that researchers face. Secondly, the way that they mitigate these kind of issues. And then thirdly, thinking about the institutional support that they received to these potential harms. Now, the Reassure project, which is what we called it, is kind of roughly going to have 3 phases that might run concurrently. So the first, which was this report, was talking specifically to researchers. And then the second stage is talking to other professionals, both in our sphere and in adjacent spheres. So we held a workshop in London last September, which spoke to a range of professionals from law enforcement, from government, as well as think tanks, as well as people working in areas like child sex exploitation and other areas with extremely graphic content, to try and work out professionally what other people in this sphere are doing. Then what we'd like to do as a third phase is to develop best practice guidance to think about how to deal with these things moving forward. And I'll come back to that later, because I think it relates very much to the findings of the research I'm going to talk about today. So in terms of the kind of methods that we went into, so we spoke to 39 Western-based academics using semi-structured interviews. Now, I say Western is a very important thing to note here. We came to the decision that the challenges that people in the Global South face are extremely distinct and are worthwhile their own kind of study, and it's something that we're looking to do in the future. But we thought we'd start quite simply with Western-based academics and then think specifically about partners in the Global South that we could do to conduct research there. We use snowball sampling methods to recruit our interviewees. Again, this is obviously not without its limitation. It potentially misses people that are not hugely embedded in our kind of VOX-Pol network of researchers. But at the same time, we thought that the best way of doing this was finding people we knew, finding people on social media, and just sort of generally finding them through our network of people that interact online and go to conferences and things like that. So as I mentioned, the whole project is thinking specifically about the harms that researchers face when conducting this kind of research. But what I'm going to speak specifically about today is how do researchers navigate these harms when they are going through their own institutional ethics approval? So something quite a narrow slice, but I think particularly important, and I think probably for almost everyone watching, whether you are a student or an academic, something that is going to be relevant to you. So, a little bit about our participants first. So 39 individuals, almost the majority of which worked at a university. So it's 26 that worked solely at a university, 6 individuals that worked both at a think tank and a university, 3 people just at a think tank, 2 people from Europe who were government-funded institutions, although they kind of are similar to universities given the way that things work there, and then 2 private institutions. It was almost an even gender split, so 22 male, 17 female. I think that comes to about 55-45%. Most individuals identified as white or white Jewish, with 7 individuals identifying as people of color. They did their work in 9 countries and represented about 13 different nationalities. When I talk about the use individual quotes or talk about research in particular, I will give a really rough geolocation. So I'll talk either about North America, Europe, or the United Kingdom, which was roughly an even split between the participants. And then individuals were researching the kinds of things that are considered the kind of quote unquote popular things to research these days. So about 29 individuals were researching jihadism, about 23 the far right, and about 5 or so were looking specifically at incels. And then a third of individuals were what we call senior academics, and 26 were early career researchers. So I think we use the UKRI definition here, where if you're an early career researcher, if you are within 8 years of your award of your PhD. So before going on to ethics, I thought I would just give a really brief primer on the types of harm that our researchers spoke about. As I mentioned, there is a full report that people can read about this, and there is a launch video if you'd prefer it kind of in video form. But I thought it's worthwhile not to signpost people off into different directions if I just gave a very brief description of the kinds of harms. So we categorize these 3 different ways. The first we called external, which is individuals who face threats from other people. So this includes death threats. So a pretty sizable proportion of our sample, I believe it was 7 or 9. I should probably have checked that, but received death threats, with some being considered credible, and even to the point in which some individuals had to contact police, and even in some cases move home. There were also people that were targeted in kind of online trolling type ways. This included doxing, which is the release of someone's kind of personal information to the internet, online harassment, trolling, things like that as well. So in general, just kind of making people experience very unliked states, going all the way up to very serious death threats and release of personal information. The second type of harm we called internal. So these are things related generally to kind of psychological well-being. So people reported symptoms that were in the same ballpark as what you might call secondary trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder. We want to be quite clear that we're not diagnosing these people. None of the research team that were interviewing people were qualified to diagnose people with these sorts of things, but they were reporting symptoms and sometimes saying it about themselves too. Other internal issues that people reported were feeling isolated or feeling depressed, and sometimes as a result of that, reporting that they started to withdraw from their own kind of personal and family life as a result. And in terms of the third type of harm, this was really the first, the external and the internal. If they were bad enough for some individuals, or at least the fear of them was bad enough, then they would start doing themselves professional harm, which is to say they were not publicizing their work. And again, for every researcher here, whether you are in academic research or whether you're in a think tank or whatever, you'll know that your institution likely puts quite a lot of pressure and quite a lot of the idea that people should be regularly publicizing their work, try and get as much reach as possible, to try and get cited as many times as possible, and also appearing in the media as much as possible. But people were reporting that if they were being harassed every time that they made a media appearance, then they would just turn down those kind of opportunities. The problem with that is that a lot of people's promotion performance indicators are based around being as public as possible and providing as much quote unquote real world impact as possible. So but people had this kind of choice where they were either going to subject themselves to this harm and have a public appearance, a kind of a public media appearance, or be active on social media, or they would avoid it and then suffer the kind of professional consequences as a result. Now, one thing we should note is that we have these three different types of harm, but they're not necessarily spread equally, and I think that's a really important point to note. So what we found was that our participants were reporting that their identity made a big difference to them. So people of colour would say that it was particularly psychologically distressing to be looking at white supremacist content, for example, or religious minorities dealing with Islamophobic content and things like that. Moreover, early career researchers were often reporting that they felt particularly unsupported. That the senior researchers were turning around and saying, "Well, I've got tenure. It's very easy for me to sort of pick and choose what I do." But early career researchers didn't necessarily felt that they had that kind of support, and therefore were potentially going to be harmed more than others. Okay, so let's move on to ethics committees. So it's worthwhile thinking a little bit about some recent research, both comes from a special issue of Terrorism and Political Violence that came out in 2021. One was by Maura Conway, who was a co-author in this research, and then one was by John Morrison, Andrew Silk, and Eki Bont, that looks specifically about researching terrorism, and in the case of Maura's article, terrorism online, and how to kind of deal and navigate with these kind of ethical issues and how that comes up. So the first thing, and this is a pretty long-standing complaint even outside of our fields in the wider social science and humanities, but general complaint is that ethics committees were really designed for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and as a result have a very heavy focus on do no harm. And when I say, and medical ethics obviously being one of the really primary sources of that, you think about a lot of these things being developed for drug trials, which could be potentially harmful to the participant, and therefore participant harm is a really important thing to think about there. But there is considerably less focus on researcher welfare within the kind of traditional ethics committee kind of way of operating. Similarly, with the kind of research that we do on kind of very emotive political type topics like terrorism, it's very often considered to be high risk for institutions. Now, we can have an argument about whether that needs to be the case. I would probably argue that a lot of that concern is not merited. It already starts to present a blockage when things move within the ethics system. So I'm sure, and every time I present this kind of research, I get more and more people coming up to me afterwards at conferences and things like that and giving me anecdotal stories of, what you might call horror stories of ethics committees, in which people are saying that they are kind of too incompetent to really understand our sphere, and therefore they shouldn't really be reviewing these kind of things because they're coming back with the most absurd advice or the most absurd kind of required revisions or things like that. And there are a few little case studies of people working in our sphere that have put these kind of stories to paper and published, and it really becomes very, very helpful both for people like me conducting this research, but also anyone that wishes to try and navigate the ethics committee, kind of letting them know that what a potentially high-risk ethics process might look like and might feel like. Brilliant. Okay, so in terms of, I'm going to split these findings talking about what our participants spoke about when they spoke about their experiences with the ethics process. So the first thing to talk about is just generally how they experience the ethics process. And I think really the most stark thing is how few individuals actually needed to go through any type of formal ethics process. So only just over a third of the 39 researchers that we spoke to went through any kind of ethics process. Now, this is perhaps somewhat emblematic of ethics committees not really understanding the online sphere very much, and there not potentially being a clear participant that is involved. So if we're talking about watching beheading videos or scraping data from social media or lurking on a forum, I mean, if we talk about it, I think it's quite clear that there are participants there. But I think as far as a lot of the time institutional ethics structures think about these things is there's not a participant that can easily consent or perhaps in their mind can easily be harmed. And therefore, for a lot of individuals, ethics committees are not necessarily, ethics processes are not necessarily relevant for this type of research. It's also well worth noting that there is a very strong divide between the United States of America and Europe when it comes to this. So what I just described about lack of a clear participant, I think it would be fair to say is much more the type of attitude that you would get in the United States or North America in particular, in which individuals, they call it an IRB in that country, Institutional Review Board, and there needs to typically be much more of a clear research participant, like if you're conducting interviews or surveys or things like that. Whereas in Europe, there are perhaps there is more of a need to conduct an ethics process. The general feeling amongst participants was that it was a pretty difficult process and not necessarily very helpful to the kind of research that they were doing. So people described it as tedious, as a pain in the ass, and a lot of things like that, that they generally felt that they weren't actually helping them to formulate the best and most ethical research project that was out there, but that rather they were just putting up unnecessary and not very kind of useful blockages out there. As I mentioned in the previous research, a lot of our participants thought that ethics committees were not competent to accurately judge their research, their proposals. And it's often people would say, oh, my ethics committee had people from chemistry, from biology, from mechanical engineering and things like that. And they didn't understand anything about the types of research we were doing and the potential ethical issues that were involved. Another thing that people mentioned as well was that they thought that there was an inadequate amount of time that was being spent on ethics applications. And I think that's a pretty important one as well. Certainly at most universities, and as someone that is on an ethics committee, I can certainly vouch for this myself, it's a relatively minor job. So most contracts of researchers, there is a chunk of your contract is research, a chunk of your contract is teaching, and you have this little admin slot at the end as well, which you kind of have to cram in. So a lot of people are, I won't necessarily say they're rushing their decisions, but there just isn't a very adequate amount of time being spent on it. And a lot of researchers, completely independent of this, are speaking about not really having enough time to do their work anyway. So it is perhaps unsurprising that a lot of individuals believe that their ethics applications were not enough time was being spent on them. And related to that as well, it's an administrative job with a very high turnover. So the composition of ethics boards changes a lot. That can be problematic if you have something that keeps on ping-ponging back and you're doing some revisions and they're asking for something else and something else it can be a completely different set of people by the time you get through the process. So I think this was quite well encapsulated by an early career researcher based in Europe that basically said, look, these sorts of ethics processes, they just don't really understand the terrorism field. And we're answering questions that seem very obvious to us, but because there's not this kind of base of knowledge, you have to explain things, very, very slowly. But it's problematic because this individual thought that they were speaking to so many different people that they were just having to work at an absolute snail's pace. and the knowledge wasn't being retained anywhere. It's just this kind of faceless ethics committee that you don't actually deal with. So the next important thing to talk about is researcher welfare within the ethics process. So our participants reported to us that they got the impression that researcher welfare was a very low priority in the range of things that they were applying for ethics approval for. And importantly, so I mentioned in the previous point that there was generally a feeling that participants' welfare was above researcher welfare, and one might make the argument that that's a somewhat reasonable point to make. But participants were also saying that they thought that their own welfare was secondary to institutional reputation. So if there was any issue that may potentially damage the institution, that their own welfare would be secondary to that. As a result, a lot of the questions in the ethical application process were skewed towards both the protections of participants as well as legal duties. People also spoke about facing extra hurdles because they thought that the kind of research that they were doing might be seen as damaging or harmful to the reputation of the university. There was also a belief that because the ethics process is very often exists at the start of a project, that individuals felt just completely cut loose after approval. So even if individuals did have some questions about researcher welfare, you might perhaps conduct that 6 months into a PhD, and then you just cut loose and there's no checking back in with the ethics committee to see if what you had predicted might be correct, or if there were any unforeseen harms or things like that as well. So I think individuals felt that it was just kind of a one-stop shop, a barrier to overcome moving forward. Other people referred to it as a box-ticking exercise as well. They thought that it wasn't necessarily an important process, and there was just some points that you kind of had to repeat on an ethics application, for every ethics application, and that would kind of get you through ethics. It is worth noting, before moving on, that there were some individuals that reported positive experiences when it comes to researcher welfare within the ethics process. So multiple individuals said that it helped them to formalize their own kind of team welfare practices. So senior researchers often, at times, said that it caused them to kind of actively think about how they were going to best protect their team. Whereas before they might have done it either in an ad hoc way, or it might have been somewhat more reactive than proactive. So it is important to note that there were some good experiences. And I think this is perhaps quite encapsulated by one senior researcher who said, in almost 2 decades worth of experience, no one has ever raised the issue of researcher welfare when conducting ethics approval, not once. So a few interesting kind of experiences from that. So one, and there were a few that were somewhat like this, but this is, I think, one of the standout ones, which is really alarming. Is one individual, when they were conducting their master's research, they were looking at jihadist propaganda videos, and they reported that they didn't have an ethics review process. What happened was that their supervisor basically just opened up an online folder for them, so they didn't actually have to download the content themselves. So that would kind of protect them legally if there was any issues with the police. But apart from that, there was no kind of discussion of researcher welfare. The words they used was basically, get to it and good luck with it. And you were basically a master's postgraduate taught student was basically had access to this potentially extremely distressing content, and there were no institutional checks at any point to make sure that they were okay with that. And then a second point, which is I think prescient as well, was, and this perhaps speaks to the last slide when I was talking about it being a box-ticking exercise, was that a lot of participants sort of suggested that the ethics process was relatively easy to navigate. You sort of understand some things that you just put if there are questions on researcher welfare. So this participant said, there are basically 3 things you can say. You can say that you've you work within a community of researchers who all experience the same thing. You can talk to them. You've got a supervisory team. They were a doctoral researcher. They've got a supervisory team that they can turn to. And then finally, they signposted. They said, oh, I know where my institutional student wellbeing service is if I need it. Now, that's fair enough. But the doctoral student also said that, A, they've never actually gone to the student wellbeing, but that they, from what they understand, they couldn't really access it if they need it. There were really long waiting lists, and it's not something that they could just turn up to if they had a problem. A lot of times institutions in the UK, certainly where I research, talk about having year-long waiting lists for these kind of student welfare. So the idea that if you were having any kind of trauma, or whether you were experiencing kind of crises from doxing or from trolling, that this is something that you could easily access is not particularly honest, was the way that this researcher spoke about it. Okay, so I think the final thing is trying to piece these together. And so we've spoken so far about perhaps the 2 points that I've made so far point to a lack of ethical oversight within research, and that as a result, it would probably be somewhat better if ethics committee were taking more of an active look into what we're doing. However, participants also reported a concern for that because it may over-problematize ethics. So one researcher, a senior researcher, said that there was this general trend towards over-problematizing ethics issues, and as a result, making it very difficult to get permission to do the kind of research that we want to do. And they described it, and I think this is quite a nice quote, as hampering the quest for knowledge. Similarly, another senior researcher, a professor, said that they believe that their institution, rather than saying, how can we put protections in place to make sure that researchers are going to be supported, that they would instead think, this is too much hassle, you're putting us at risks, and we need to shut this kind of research down. Clearly, that is not what anyone involved in this sphere wants. So the general kind of trends that people were talking about here were, first of all, that there was just this general concern that although a lot of participants spoke about the need for some kind of mitigation of the harms that I spoke about at the start, that if the institutions had their way, then it would become more and more difficult to do this kind of research. Multiple participants spoke about, with the kind of move towards a more neoliberal university, particularly in Europe and particularly in the UK, with the introduction of tuition fees and it turning more into something like you might find in business, that comes with a certain risk aversion to it. And if they think that something is going to be problematic, either from a legal perspective or from a reputational damage perspective, for example, if it got in the press that researchers were being specifically harmed and they weren't protecting them, that they would just shut this kind of research down. So as a result, researchers were saying that to avoid all this, they were strategically not raising welfare issues. And as a result, a lot of them would say that they would try and develop their own personal coping mechanisms, or they would try and design kind of unofficial support for their team. So I think everything that we've spoken about so far kind of leaves us with what we might think of as something of a catch-22. So for some people, I have no doubt, there being quite a hands-off ethics process when it comes to online research. Some people will think that that's a very good thing. They won't feel like their research is being blocked. However, I think the sorts of things that I've spoken about, the harms that I spoke about at the start of this research, that are not just documented by our team, but by a range of other pieces of research over the last few years, suggest that it's not really sustainable. There does need to be ethical oversight when it comes to researcher welfare. We all understand that the ethical process is not perfect, but there's a pretty long history within academia that show that researchers can't really be left to make their own decisions when it comes to welfare without any kind of oversight whatsoever. However, the flip side of that is that researchers also need to be able to conduct research. I know this will sound somewhat self-congratulatory to people in our field, but I really think that the work that we do is very, very important. I think if we want to frame it in the kind of way that universities do it, I think it makes real world impact. So this is important research that needs to happen. And I think that it's kind of leaves us with this problem, and this is the way that a lot of our participants framed it to us, is that they felt that they were left with one of two ends of the spectrum, that either there would be little to no ethical oversight, and there would be all of these kind of harms that I spoke about, both external, internal, and professional, or institutions would step in and start to provide ethical oversight and protection, but as a result, it would become more difficult to conduct the kind of research they wanted to do. So people thought that it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't type situation. So I'll just finish up just by thinking a little bit about potential ways of breaking this kind of impasse. So I'm of the view that the catch-22 that I spoke about in the last situation is not actually the reality. It is actually a false dichotomy. There are some other tactics we can take, and if institutions are willing to be receptive, that there is some kind of a middle ground to be found here. But I think the really important thing to stress here is that it must be finessed. If we focus completely on the harms that can be caused, we run the risk of universities going and institutions going into defensive mode. But if we don't talk about them at all, we run the risk of harm to researchers. So perhaps the most obvious thing to think about is thinking about how we can educate ethics committees better. So as I mentioned at the start, there's general feeling that many ethics committees are incompetent to adequately judge our research. And we should, as a result, try and take as many opportunities as possible to educate them. So one good example was from that research by John Morrison and colleagues that I mentioned earlier. So that whole article is this kind of ethics framework, which has a series of kind of yes/no questions that are specifically designed for ethics reviewers. That they are asking people that they're designed for people that are not necessarily experts in our field, but that they can try and think about the answers in a slightly more a slightly better, more thorough way. That paper also makes the point that there should be opportunities outside of the formal ethics process to present research to committee members. So it shouldn't necessarily have to be, and it will depend on different institutions, either an electronic form or a Word document where you just answer some questions in typeset and then you get some feedback and then you amend them or whatever. But there should be an ongoing ethics conversation in which you can present your research, you can talk about past research, and just have kind of an ongoing conversation about it. Now it's worth noting, and I mentioned this before, this would require a pretty sizable change in the way that universities currently undertake ethical review. The kind of time that people are apportioned within their job on ethics committee is not really enough to be engaging with all different manner of researchers and going to research seminars from colleagues and things like that. It would have to make ethics an important role that takes up, that they have an appropriate amount of time for. The next thing, and I touched on this in the previous slide, that would be useful are tailored guidelines. So we have, for example, some, in the last couple of years, some ethics framework for terrorism research in general. So the article by John Morrison and colleagues that I mentioned before, as well as that, we also have some guidance for online research in general. So the Association of Internet Researchers, the British Psychological Society, have specific guidelines to think about online research. So what I think we need from that is a specific set of guidelines to think about online researchers, because we have a pretty specific set of challenges that if there are guidelines that can be A, referenced, and B, given to ethics committees for them to think more thoroughly about these kinds of issues. And then finally, and Maura makes this point in her article in TPV, is although us talking about it and having conversations and even having lectures like this are useful, conversations themselves are not enough. And it's important to put our thoughts to paper. So more reflective pieces like that I mentioned before, of people talking about their experiences navigating ethics processes, as well as people offering reflective practices about how researcher welfare is dealt with as well, how teams of individuals together have thought about how they're going to mitigate these sorts of risks. I'm quite certain that in almost every team of online terrorism, extremism researchers, there will be some informal practices that are taken. But if we start to commit these and publish them in both journal articles and book chapters and just other kinds of reports, then we just add to the general pool of knowledge that's out there. And it will help the next generation of researchers when they're coming to these kinds of issues. Brilliant. So that's about it from me. Here is the slide of further research of the half dozen or so pieces of research that I think are very important when it comes to this field. I think I'll try and find a way of making the slides available so you don't have to type all this out. You can just copy and paste it. So with that, that's about it from me, I think. Except the one thing I'll say is this is an ongoing project from us. If you have either questions about what we're doing or experiences that you wish to share and just enter a conversation about it, then feel free to email me at j.whittaker@swansea.adc.uk. And with that, I will hand back to Sean.
Oh, brilliant. Really, really interesting. Thank you very much, Joe. I think I just had a few bubbling questions off the top of my head here that I'd love to discuss with you, even from my enlightenment. I'd love to hear, you mentioned at the start you're co-chair of the ethics committee in Swansea, and you're going to step down soon. Can you speak a little bit to your experiences on this? Did you have a piece of online extremism research put before the committee while you were there? And did you see what was your experience with your colleagues who might not have been from our field towards it?
Yeah, so I think, and obviously, perhaps the Swansea situation is not quite like most other universities because we've got about a dozen permanent researchers on contract there. So, and then with that, there's about 24 PhD students. So there's a lot of terrorism and extremism online research that's coming through and being done. So yes, quite a lot of things going through the ethics committee there. I think my main reflection is that permanent members of research or senior members that have been doing it for 5, 6, 7 years usually turn over good, quite reflective ethics applications. Almost all of them require some kind of revision. That's just the nature of it. But I can't remember the last time I saw, and in fact, this mostly speaks for all members of our criminology team. Generally, they're thinking about the issues and they're turning it in. They're cognizant of what some of the dangers are, including to themselves. The main problems we had was students, undergraduate dissertations, master's dissertations in particular, where students usually, and universities will differ on this, but usually there will be some kind of, in social science degrees, some kind of methods course in which they'll touch on ethics, but not really sufficiently. And a proper ethics application, if you're going to do something like potentially engage with problematic people online or look at potentially distressing content or just be going places that might have some kind of cyber risk or whatever, that requires quite a thoughtful reflection on ethics. But students hadn't necessarily been prepared for it, and there were instances in which it felt like their supervisors hadn't really given their applications much oversight before submitting them. Now, this is compounded even worse insofar as particularly undergraduate students are on such a strict timeline because they're in their third year. They will submit their ethics application in October, November, and they're usually submitting it at Swansea at least in March or April, which means as an ethics committee, you've got to turn it around. So when you're saying to a student, no, you need to make some pretty substantial changes here, that can really damage them. And I think in this instance, a lot of time, the people that need to think more reflectively about it are those students' supervisors and say, oh, no, what you've got here isn't ready for that, because you're going to lose, perhaps a week or two for the ethics committee to actually get it back to the student. And if it's nowhere near ready to pass, you're probably going to end up losing a really significant amount of time before you can actually start to do the research. So I can certainly, while there were loads of stories from our participants that I completely agree with, I can also understand that there are a good number of ethics applications that just come nowhere near ready.
Oh yeah, for sure. I call them the systematic literature review option. That there's no way you've left this too late. Your ethics review is not up to scratch. You don't have time to do a method now. Sorry. That was
I mean, you're right, but I don't think we've ever forced a student to do that. We've had some tense conversations with the student, their supervisor, and a couple of members of the committee where it's like, there are a dozen pretty sizable problems here, but we've almost always been able to find them something, because I hate the idea of blocking research, but sometimes students just by their own inertia are just like, I don't want to do this. I'm just going to do literature based, basically.
um I do think I've some thoughts about there's something here and this to break through the false dichotomy is like maybe it's to do with the process. Maybe it's to do with this idea that we need to run a ethics application through this kind of centralized hub of all the different fields judging it. When, like you said, there's this expertise gap that everyone has. Like you couldn't really approve someone's kind of chemical engineering ethics unless there was something really glaringly like they're going to dip their hands in acid, right? Then you'd be like, okay, you can't do that. But for things that you don't know about, you really can't contribute. And I do wonder what your thoughts on like localizing ethical approval to, if not a faculty level, then to like a school level, right? To like for us, like a criminology level, criminology lumped in with psychology maybe, but that's about it. And then keep it in house.
Yeah, I think a lot of British institutions have something like what you're describing. So before we redid our ethics process, it was just everything criminology would come to us, and then that was. But the problem is that anything that is deemed to be pretty high risk will get bumped up to the wider university ethics boards, and that's where a lot of the horror stories were coming from. So, in research that Lon Dawson and Amar Angersingham did, they spoke about their experience in. So this is published research, not participants. They spoke about their experience trying to navigate their Skype research with foreign fighters, and they were saying that for one of the ethics committees, it got bumped up to the full institutional ones, and it was 22 different people, and it consisted of a lot of people from STEM, a lot of people that were not even academics at all, and the way they described it was that it was kind of like a shopping list. People would just be like, "Oh, this and that, and this and that, and this and that," and it's not really conducive to thinking about the wider ethical issues. It was just like, here are a few little bits and bobs, and oftentimes these things are either make it so difficult, or even at times are conflicting, and it becomes very difficult. I certainly know that I've had some experiences when I've had higher risk research that's got bumped all the way up. Is you lose the expertise, but the concern about reputational risk gets higher if it's at the full ethics board, and then all of a sudden that's where a lot of these really big blockages come from.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think we have a similar system in that it is in house until it is an issue, and then it is out of our hands. Is effectively what happens, which can be very frustrating. But often, that is the case, right? For 90% of applications, that works, and then the 10%, those are the problems, and that's the ones we actually might get really good research out of, and that's our issue faced. The other thing that I think you're alluding to is maybe we should kind of disentangle as a process like ethical approval and researcher welfare as two separate things. And that ethical approval is like an ex ante authorization stage, right? Where we just have the big things that we might consider before doing the research. And then researcher welfare is something that comes later, is siloed so people can feel like they can come forward without risking their future research. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's good, but I still think that you want students in particular, certainly staff members as well, but I'm when I'm sitting doing ethics, it's oftentimes students are the ones that I have most concern for, because they're not professionals, they've not necessarily been working in the space arena at that time. Often when there are any kind of ethical questions, but particularly researcher welfare questions, I just want them to have thought about it first. I'm well aware that their supervisors probably said, say this, say that, you know, etc.,
Yeah.
etc. Like, I'm not an idiot. But I just want them to think, like, do I need to, you know, if I'm going to lurk on a forum, but it requires me to register an account, do I use my own personal email address? If I'm going to, you know, do a survey and disseminate it via my social media, but it's on, you know, potentially inflammatory topics, do you use your own personal social media account, which therefore, by the way, has links to all of the contacts you've got? That's the way social media works. So you're not only putting yourself at risk, but your friends and family at risk as well, with photos, maybe even photos of their children and things like that. I just want them to think about these kind of things first, and then have a bit of a plan in action for what they're going to do about it. I'm also well aware that what they put on there is oftentimes ignored.
Yeah.
It's you know, we live in the real world here, but I just want them to have thought about it once before going through it.
Yeah, I
So,
think
sorry, I've horribly diverted from your question there. That I still think it would need to be part of the ethics process, if that makes sense.
yeah.
It should be something that they reflect on before beginning a project. But I do really also like the idea of kind of an ongoing researcher welfare thing as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good answer. I mean, I think that's the thing for our people, our audience who are most likely on the other side, on the student side, the applicant side. I think due diligence is the way of the game, right?
Yeah,
That's if you have a little bit of due diligence, a little bit of care, you will go a lot further with ethics sports in general. Then
yeah,
you'll save yourself a lot of time and effort.
yeah,
Well,
100%.
well, apart from that, I think that's all my questions. I thought it was fascinating talk. Thanks again for sharing your time with us, Joe. And
Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me, Sean.
no worries. Of hopefully get you back next year. And then
Yeah,
more positive and how we fix blasted through the false dichotomy and it's all sorted then.
yeah, I'll be back on next year to say everything's fine and there are no more.
It'll be a very short presentation. All right, brilliant. Well, thank you everyone for who's post joining us on YouTube or the students watching this. Thank you. I hope you took out something away from it. Okay, goodbye.